The fog came up off the Lorraine farmland before dawn, so thick a man could barely see the next vehicle in his own column. Somewhere inside that wall of grey, the engines of German Panthers were grinding forward, nearly 50 tons apiece of the finest tanks the Third Reich had ever fielded. Waiting for them in the mist was a machine its own crews had already learned to distrust. Thin enough that a heavy machine gun could punch through its flank, open at the top like a tin can with the lid pried off. The men who designed it had thrown away almost all of its armour just to make it fast. And on the morning of September 19th, 1944, near a French village most of the world has never heard of, that gamble was about to be tested against the best armour in Europe. Within minutes, 5 of those German tanks would be burning. The machine that killed them was called the M18 Hellcat, and to understand why it should never have won that fight, you have to understand how strange a weapon it really was. Because almost everything that made it deadly, on paper, should have gotten its crews killed. Let us start with the thing everyone noticed first. The M18 was fast, not fast for a tank. Fast for anything on tracks, ever. On a good road, it could reach 55 miles per hour, a speed no other tracked armoured vehicle of the Second World War could touch, and one that most tanks built for decades afterward could not match either. It ran on a 9-cylinder Continental radial engine, putting out around 400 horsepower, and it rode on a torsion bar suspension that let it sprint across broken country like a sports car built out of steel plate. Test drivers reportedly clocked it even higher on smooth ground. For a vehicle that weighed close to 18 tons, that was almost unnatural. The vehicle had not started life as a finished idea. It grew out of a string of experimental designs as American engineers chased the perfect balance of speed and firepower, and the Buick division of General Motors turned the final concept into a sleek, low, purposeful machine. When it rolled off the line, it looked less like the boxy tanks around it and more like something built for a race. Low to the ground, rounded, hungry. The nickname Hellcat suited it. But the closer you looked, the more you understood how much had been sacrificed to earn that grace. But that speed came at a price, and the price was terrifying. To make the Hellcat light enough to move like that, the designers stripped away its protection until there was almost nothing left. The armour ranged from around an inch at its thickest down to a skin only a fraction of that on the sides and rear. In places you could measure it in millimetres, you could count on one hand. A German anti-tank round would pass through it as if it were plywood. Even shell splinters and heavy machine gun fire were a genuine threat. And the turret, where the commander, the gunner and the loader all worked, was open to the sky. No roof. Nothing overhead at all. Rain fell in on the crew, so did tree bursts, mortar fragments and grenades. Snipers could see straight down into the fighting compartment. The soldiers gave it names that told you exactly how they felt about it. To some it was a coffin on tracks. To the doubters it was the paper tank, a fighting vehicle that traded away the one thing a tank is supposed to give you, which is the feeling that you might actually survive being hit. So why on earth would the United States Army build something like this on purpose? The answer lies in an idea that was fiercely argued over in the years before America entered the war, an idea tied to a general named Leslie McNair. In the early stages of the fighting in Europe, the German blitzkrieg had terrified the world. Massed panzers punched through defensive lines and tore into the rear areas before anyone could react. American planners went looking for an answer, and the answer they landed on was not to meet tanks with tanks. It was to build a separate breed of vehicle whose entire purpose was to hunt armor and kill it. The Doctrine had a blunt motto: seek, strike, destroy. Tank destroyers were not meant to slug it out toe-to-toe, taking hits and trading blows. They were meant to rush to wherever the panzers were breaking through, mass together, ambush from cover, hit hard, and vanish before the enemy could shoot back. Speed was the armor. The theory went that a vehicle fast enough to reach the danger, fast enough to reposition, and fast enough to slip away did not need thick steel, because it would never sit still long enough to be a target. Protection, the thinkers argued, was for tanks that stood and fought. A hunter moved. There was fierce disagreement about all of this, even among American commanders. Some argued that the whole scheme was backward, that the best answer to a tank was simply a better tank, and that carving off a separate branch of thin-skinned hunters split resources and muddled the mission. Others insisted the tank destroyer was the future of anti-armor warfare, that mobility and massed firepower would always beat a static defense. The argument was never fully settled on paper. It would have to be settled in the field, in mud and fog and fire, by the young men actually riding these machines into the path of the Panthers. The M18 Hellcat was the purest expression of that whole philosophy ever put into production. Everything about it served the ambush. The open turret that left the crew exposed also gave them something priceless, which was vision. Commanders could stand up, look around, hear the battlefield, and spot movement that a buttoned-up tank crew would have missed entirely. The 5 men inside, the commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver, and the assistant driver, were trained to find a firing position, kill what came into their sights, and be gone before the return fire arrived. Their gun was a 76mm, a respectable weapon that could shatter most of what it hit, carrying around 45 rounds of ammunition. And here is where the design ran into the hardest wall of the war. The 76mm gun, for all its virtues, could not reliably punch through the front of a German Panther. The Panther's glacis, its sloped frontal plate, was thick and angled so cleverly that American rounds tended to skip off it, like stones off a frozen pond. Head-on, at range, the Hellcat was often bringing a lighter punch to a fight the enemy was built to win. The Panther could see farther, its gun hit harder, and its frontal armor could shrug off shots the Hellcat crews prayed would land. On an open field, in clear weather, at a distance, the German tank had almost every advantage that mattered. It is worth pausing on what the Panther actually was, because the Hellcat's achievement means nothing without it. The Panther is widely regarded as one of the finest tanks of the entire war, a blend of firepower, protection, and mobility that the Allies struggled to answer for years. Its long, high-velocity gun could kill almost anything on the battlefield at ranges where the enemy could barely make it out. Its sloped frontal armor turned direct hits into ricochets. German crews who knew how to use it could dominate an open field. This was the standard against which the thin, open-topped American Hunter was measured, and by every column in the ledger that counted on paper, the Hellcat came up short. Which is exactly what makes the fog over Lorraine so extraordinary. Which is exactly why what happened in Lorraine matters so much, because the Hellcat was never meant to fight fair. It was meant to fight from the side, from the shadows, from wherever the enemy was not looking. And in the 3rd week of September 1944, the ground, the weather, and a badly planned German attack handed the tank destroyer crews the one kind of battle they had been built to win. By that autumn, General George Patton's Third Army had raced across France and slammed into the region of Lorraine, close to the German frontier. The advance had outrun its own fuel. Tanks sat idle, waiting for gasoline that trickled forward far too slowly, and the drive that had felt unstoppable in the summer ground down into a grinding fight for towns, rivers, and muddy ridgelines. Into that pause, the German command saw an opportunity to strike back. Adolf Hitler himself had ordered a counterattack meant to hit Patton's flank and blunt the American advance. The force assembled for it was the 5th Panzer Army, and part of it fell under the command of Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most capable armoured leaders. On paper, the counterstroke looked dangerous. 2 fresh panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, rolled forward carrying brand-new Panther tanks straight from the factory. All told, the German force could field more than 250 tanks and assault guns. It should have been a hammer blow, but there was a rot inside that hammer, and it was the crews. Those beautiful new Panthers were manned by men who had received only about 2 weeks of training. They were green, hastily assembled, thrown into battle in machines they barely knew how to fight. The brigades had almost no reconnaissance to scout ahead of them. They did not know the ground. They did not know exactly where the Americans were. And they were about to attack straight into a screen of veterans. Standing in their path was Combat Command A of the United States 4th Armored Division, led by a tough, clear-eyed colonel named Bruce Clark. His force included Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, armored infantry, and the reason we are here, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its companies of M18 Hellcats. Around 36 of those thin-skinned hunters were spread across the Lorraine countryside near the village of Aracort, dug in, watching, waiting. And then came the fog. On the morning of September 19th, A heavy autumn mist settled over the fields and low hills, so dense that visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. For the Germans, that fog was a curse dressed up as a blessing. It hid their approach, yes, but it also erased every advantage their Panthers held. The long reach of the German gun meant nothing when you could not see past the end of your own tank. The thick frontal armor meant nothing when the enemy was not in front of you at all, but suddenly beside you, close enough to hear. The green crews, already lost without scouts, now drove blind into a landscape full of hunters who knew every fold of ground. This was the ambush the Hellcat had been dreaming of since the day it was designed. The first clashes came early and confused, tanks and half-tracks looming out of the murk at point-blank range. Light American cavalry tanks tangled with German armor near the outposts and took losses. But as the Panzers pushed on, they blundered straight into the tank destroyers. One of the sharpest actions of the whole day belonged to a platoon of M18s from Company C of the 704th, led by a lieutenant named Edwin Leiper, moving toward the village of Rechicourt-le-Petit. Leiper's Hellcats caught the German tanks in the fog, and what followed is the moment that sits at the heart of this story. In a span of roughly 5 minutes, the platoon knocked out 5 tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade, the Panther Brigade, for the loss of a single M18. 5 German tanks gone in the time it takes to boil a kettle. And the platoon did not stop there. As the fight rolled on, those same tank destroyers accounted for 10 more enemy tanks, though it cost them 2 more of their own. Within that furious action, one Hellcat stood above the rest. An M18 commanded by Sergeant Henry Hartmann knocked out 6 of the German tanks by itself, and most of them were the much-feared Panthers. Think about that for a second. One open-topped, paper-thin tank destroyer, the very machine the skeptics said was a death trap, personally ending the careers of half a dozen of the best tanks Germany could build, and living to tell it. That is the true face of the legend behind the title. Not one clean, tidy scoreboard, but a swirling, close-range brawl in the fog, where a single well-handled Hellcat could rack up a killing streak that reads like fiction. Picture the reality of it from inside that open turret. The engine roaring, the smell of cordite and wet earth, the loader slamming another round into the breach as fast as his arms would move. No roof over their heads, so every sound of the battle poured straight in. The crack of guns, the ring of hits on steel, the shouting. The commander standing high, straining to pick a target out of the shifting grey, calling corrections while the gunner traversed onto a shape that might be a Panther, or might be another Hellcat. A single mistake, a single German gunner who spotted them first, and it was over. They fought that entire action knowing they had almost nothing between their bodies and the enemy but their own speed and their own nerve. How did they do it? Exactly the way the Doctrine said they should. In that mist, the Hellcats used their speed and their low, hunched profiles to slip into firing positions on the flanks. They fired from slight depressions in the ground, hull down, hard to spot. They aimed for the sides and the rear, where even a Panther's armor was thin enough for the 76mm gun to tear straight through. They shot, they moved, and they let the fog swallow them again before the surviving Germans could work out where the fire was coming from. A Panther that could have destroyed a Hellcat at a mile in the open never got the chance, because it never saw the Hellcat until its own hull was already torn open. Elsewhere across that same battlefield, the story repeated itself. Another group of Hellcats from the battalion crept up on a company of Panthers near the village of Bézange-la-Petite, firing from a low rise, and reportedly knocked out 7 of them before the day had fully broken. American Shermans, faster to swing their turrets than the heavier Panthers, flanked and killed Panzers of their own. Again and again, German tanks that had been built to dominate at long range died at knife-fighting distance, hit from angles they never expected, by an enemy they could barely see. By the time the fog burned off and the fighting near Aracort settled, the tally was staggering and one-sided. Over the span of the battle, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion alone knocked out around 39 German tanks. The cost to the battalion was 4 M18s destroyed and 3 more damaged. Let those two figures sit next to each other, 39 of the enemy's tanks against a handful of their own. A paper tank had walked into a fight against the best armor in Europe and come out with a kill ratio that generals dream about. The wider battle told the same tale on a larger scale. The German counterattack that Hitler had ordered to smash Patton's flank did not smash anything. It shattered itself. Of the more than 250 tanks and assault guns the Germans committed, roughly 86 were destroyed outright, well over 100 more were damaged or broke down, and only a small fraction remained fit to fight by the end of the month. Manteufel's fresh panzer brigades were effectively wrecked. Combat Command A, by contrast, lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers across the fighting, a real and painful price, but nothing close to the ruin inflicted on the enemy. By the end of September, the German offensive in Lorraine was finished, and it did not end in a single morning. The fighting around Aracort flared on and off for days, from the middle of September toward the end of the month, as the German command fed in more armor and tried again and again to break through. Each time, the same pattern repeated. The Panthers came on, often across ground that gave the defenders cover, and the American tanks and tank destroyers met them from the flanks and the ridgelines and cut them down. Fresh Panthers kept arriving, and fresh Panthers kept burning. By the time von Manteuffel finally abandoned the effort, his armoured brigades had been bled white for almost nothing in return. The line had held, Patton's flank was secure, and the machine everyone had written off had done far more than its share of the killing. It would be easy, and a little dishonest, to hand all the credit to the machine. The truth is richer than that. The Hellcats won at Aracort because of a rare alignment of everything going right at once. The fog neutralized the Panthers' greatest strengths. The green German crews had no idea where they were going. The American gunners were veterans who had learned their trade the hard way across France. The terrain gave the tank destroyers cover and firing positions, and the Doctrine, the whole seek, strike, destroy philosophy that had looked so reckless on the drawing board, finally got the exact conditions it had been designed for. Take away the fog, put those same Hellcats on an open plain against those same Panthers in clear daylight, and the story might have read very differently. That is the honest lesson of the paper tank. Its thin armor and open turret were not secretly brilliant. They were a genuine dangerous weakness, and the crews knew it every single day they climbed inside. Plenty of Hellcat men died because of exactly those flaws in other fields, on other mornings, when the ambush went the other way. But in the right hands, in the right place, at the right moment, the very qualities that made the M18 look fragile were the qualities that made it lethal. Speed put it where the Panthers were not looking. Vision let it see them first, and a fast gun on a fast chassis, firing from the flank, did not need to survive a hit because it never planned to take one. After the war, the arguments about American tank destroyer doctrine never really ended. Critics pointed out fairly that the whole concept of a separate armor hunting branch was flawed, that lightly protected vehicles often could not do what was asked of them, and that the future belonged to well-rounded tanks that could both take a punch and throw one. Within a few years, the tank destroyer branch was disbanded, and the M18's particular breed of speed-over-everything design faded from the battlefield. In that sense, the doubters were partly right. The paper tank was a dead end. But dead ends can still leave landmarks. The Hellcats soldiered on in armies around the world for years after the guns fell silent in Europe, valued for exactly the trait that had always defined it, that blistering speed. And whenever historians line up the armored vehicles of the war and ask which of them actually earned their keep against enemy tanks, the M18 keeps forcing its way into the conversation, wildly out of proportion to how flimsy it looked parked next to a Panther. And yet the Hellcat left a mark that outlived the doctrine that spawned it. It ended the war as one of the most effective armored vehicles the United States fielded, measured by the simple, brutal math of how many enemy tanks it killed against how many of its own were lost. Its speed record on tracks stood for a remarkably long time, and Aracort became the story that veterans and historians came back to again and again, the day the fragile little tank destroyer that everyone mocked walked into the fog and dismantled the pride of the Panzer Force. There is something worth sitting with in that. We tend to remember the war through its heaviest steel, the giant tanks with the thickest armor and the biggest guns, the machines that looked invincible. But Aracort is a reminder that the battlefield rarely rewards the thing that merely looks strongest. It rewards the crew that sees first, moves fastest, and fires from the angle no one is watching. 5 German tanks burning in 5 minutes, 1 Hellcat with 6 Panthers to its name. A vehicle so thinly armoured its own men called it a coffin, turning a morning of fog into one of the most lopsided armoured victories of the entire Western campaign. The men inside those open turrets knew the odds better than anyone. They knew a single well-aimed shell would end them. They climbed in anyway, and they went hunting, and on that grey morning near Aracort they proved that courage and cunning and a little cover can beat raw armour plate. Most of their names never made the history books. Sergeant Hartman's did, and Lieutenant Leiper's did, but for everyone we can name, there were dozens who fought and bled in those thin steel boxes and asked for nothing but the chance to do their job and go home. They deserve to be remembered as more than a footnote to a famous tank. So the next time you hear someone call the M18 Hellcat a paper tank, you can tell them the rest of the story. Tell them about the fog over Lorraine and the green Panther crews driving blind and the veterans who were waiting for them in the mist. Tell them how the fastest thing on tracks used the one weapon the Germans could not counter, which was the ability to be somewhere they were not looking. And tell them that sometimes the underdog wins not by being tougher, but by being smarter, faster, and braver than the machine that was supposed to crush it. If stories like this pull you in, the forgotten fights and the overlooked machines and the crew's history nearly left behind, consider subscribing. There are more of these waiting to be told, more moments where the odds were all wrong and the outcome still surprised everyone. Thank you for spending this time in the fog with the men of the tank destroyers. We will see you on the next one.